My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 32 years old. 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage, a loving husband, and a future bright with possibility. Tonight, I'm sitting in my sister's guest room with a bruised cheek, divorce papers, on the nightstand, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the truth has a way of setting everything right. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the moment my whole world came crashing down with a single slap that echoed through the marble foyer of the Grandview Country Club. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The night of March 15th started like any other corporate event I'd attended with my husband David over the past 5 years of our marriage. He worked as a senior project manager at Meridian Financial Solutions, one of those mid-sized consulting firms that specialized in helping smaller companies streamline their operations and improve profitability. David had been with the company for 7 years, climbing steadily up the corporate ladder with what I believed was hard work, dedication, and genuine talent. I should have known something was different about this particular event from the moment David started obsessing over the details weeks in advance. Usually, he was casual about work functions, treating them as necessary networking opportunities, but nothing more. This time, however, he spent hours selecting his outfit, researched every attendee who would be present, and even hired a personal trainer for 2 months leading up to the event to ensure he looked his absolute best. When I asked about his unusual level of preparation, he brushed off my questions with vague comments about an important announcement and potential promotions being discussed. The Grandview Country Club was exactly the kind of venue that screamed old money and established success. Located in the hills overlooking our city, it boasted manicured golf courses, crystal chandeliers in every room, and the kind of understated luxury that made you feel simultaneously impressed and slightly inadequate. As we pulled into the circular driveway in David's freshly detailed BMW, I smoothed down my navy blue cocktail dress and checked my reflection in the passenger mirror one final time. David had insisted I wear this particular dress, claiming it made me look sophisticated and successful. At 5 feet 6 inches with shoulder-length black hair, and what my mother always called distinctive Asian features inherited from my Taiwanese grandmother, I'd learned over the years that David had very specific ideas about how I should present myself at his work events. I was to be charming, but not attention-seeking, intelligent, but not intimidating, supportive, but never overshadowing. Tonight felt no different, except for the unusual tension radiating from David as we walked toward the entrance. The cocktail reception was being held in the club's main ballroom, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city lights below. Approximately 60 people were in attendance, a mix of Meridian employees, their spouses, and several clients who David had mentioned were particularly important to the company's future growth. The atmosphere was festive but professional, with servers circulating champagne and hors d'oeuvres while a jazz quartet provided background music. I'd attended enough of these events to know the unspoken rules and social dynamics at play. The wives and husbands of employees were expected to mingle gracefully, ask appropriate questions about work without delving too deeply into specifics, and generally contribute to an atmosphere of success and stability. I'd become quite good at this role over the years, having worked as a marketing coordinator before my marriage and possessing enough business knowledge to hold intelligent conversations without appearing threatening to anyone's professional standing. David immediately steered us toward a group that included his direct supervisor, Marcus Rodriguez, and several other senior managers. Marcus was a man in his early 50s with graying temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successful leadership. He'd always been cordial to me at previous events, asking polite questions about my volunteer work with the local animal shelter and remembering details from our previous conversations. As we approached the group, I noticed David's hand on my lower back felt unusually firm, almost possessive. He launched into animated conversation about a recent project, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he was trying to impress someone. I smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, sipping my champagne and observing the other couples around us. That's when I first noticed Jennifer Walsh, Marcus's executive assistant, standing slightly apart from the main group. Jennifer was a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that suggested both professionalism and authority. What struck me most, however, was the way she was watching David. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her gaze that made me pay closer attention. As the evening progressed, David became increasingly animated and confident. He regaled the group with stories about recent client successes, his role in securing new contracts, and his vision for the company's future growth. I found myself studying him as he spoke, noting details I'd somehow overlooked before. The way he embellished certain facts, making his contributions sound more significant than I remembered him describing at home. The casual way he took credit for ideas that I recalled him mentioning came from team brainstorming sessions. The subtle but persistent way he positioned himself as indispensable to every success story he shared. It wasn't that David was outright lying, but rather that he was painting a picture of his professional achievements that seemed more vibrant and central than the reality I thought I knew. I found myself questioning whether I'd simply been unaware of the full extent of his contributions, or whether something else was happening that I didn't understand. Inside, David immediately poured himself a large glass of whiskey and disappeared into his home office, shutting the door with more force than necessary. I changed out of my cocktail dress and into comfortable pajamas, trying to process the evening's events and my growing sense that something significant was happening that I didn't understand. I'd always prided myself on being observant and intuitive, skills that had served me well in my marketing career and in navigating the social complexities of David's professional world. Tonight, however, I felt like I'd been watching a play where everyone else knew the script except me. The tension in the room during Marcus's speech, Jennifer Walsh's pointed questions, David's extreme reaction to what should have been routine corporate communication, none of it made sense based on what I thought I knew about David's work and professional standing. Lying in bed that night, listening to David pacing in his office below, I found myself reviewing our 5-year marriage with a new perspective. David had always been ambitious and image-conscious, traits that I'd initially found attractive and motivating. He worked long hours, traveled frequently for client meetings, and brought home stories of professional challenges and successes that painted him as a rising star in his field. But as I replayed conversations and memories with tonight's revelations, in mind, I began to notice inconsistencies I'd previously overlooked. The expensive restaurants he claimed were client dinners, but where he never seemed to order anything substantial. The business trips that lasted longer than seemed necessary for the stated purposes. The way he deflected specific questions about his projects with vague responses about confidentiality requirements. Most troubling was the gradual realization that I knew very little about the actual details of David's work. He spoke frequently about his professional life, but always in general terms or in ways that made him sound impressive without providing concrete information. When I'd asked more specific questions in the past, he'd dismissed my curiosity as unnecessary or claimed that I wouldn't find the technical aspects interesting. At the time, I'd accepted these explanations as reasonable. David worked in financial consulting, a field that did involve confidentiality requirements and complex technical details. I had my own interests and volunteer commitments that kept me busy, and I'd been content to support his career without needing to understand every aspect of it. Now, however, I wondered whether my trust had been naive. The sound of David's office door slamming shut startled me from my thoughts. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of running water in the master bathroom. When he finally came to bed, he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd had several drinks. He lay on his side, facing away from me, his breathing eventually evening out into sleep while I remained awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of an evening that had left me with more questions than answers. The next morning brought no clarity, only an intensification of David's strange behavior. He was awake before me, something that rarely happened on weekends, and I found him in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a complex problem. His laptop was open on the counter, displaying what appeared to be email communications, though he quickly closed the screen when I entered the room. When I tried to initiate normal morning conversation, asking about his plans for the day and whether he wanted to grab brunch at our usual spot, David's responses were distracted and irritable. He claimed he had urgent work to catch up on and couldn't commit to any social plans. This struck me as odd since David was usually protective of his weekend time and had never before described routine work tasks as urgent enough to interrupt our personal time. I spent that Saturday attending to my own errands and commitments, including a shift at the animal shelter where I volunteered 3 days a week. Working with the animals usually provided a sense of peace and purpose that helped me process difficult emotions, but today I found myself distracted and unsettled. The other volunteers noticed my preoccupation, and I found myself deflecting their concerned questions with the same vague assurances that David often used with me. During my lunch break, I sat in my car in the shelter's parking lot and impulsively called my older sister Emily. Emily lived across town with her husband and 2 young children, working as a nurse practitioner while maintaining what seemed like effortless balance between her professional and personal responsibilities. She'd always been someone I could talk to when I needed perspective, though I'd rarely needed to discuss serious marital concerns before. Emily answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the kind of genuine affection that reminded me why she'd been my closest confidant since childhood. When I attempted to describe the previous evening's events and David's subsequent behavior, I found myself struggling to articulate exactly what felt wrong. The individual incidents seemed minor when described separately, but collectively they created a pattern that made me deeply uneasy. Emily listened without interruption, asking occasional clarifying questions that helped me organize my thoughts. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding with characteristic directness. She pointed out that my description of David's behavior suggested someone under significant stress, possibly related to work problems that he wasn't sharing with me. She also gently noted that my own anxiety might be amplifying normal workplace tensions into something more sinister than they actually were. Her perspective was both reassuring and frustrating. I wanted her to validate my concerns, to confirm that David's behavior was as unusual and troubling as it seemed to me. Instead, she offered rational explanations and encouraged me to communicate more directly with David about whatever was bothering him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment that would change everything began when Marcus Rodriguez called for everyone's attention. The jazz quartet ceased playing, and the room gradually quieted as guests turned toward the makeshift stage area where Marcus stood with a microphone. His expression was serious, and there was an energy in the room that suggested this was more than just a routine thank you speech. Marcus began by thanking everyone for attending and acknowledging the hard work of his team over the past year. He spoke about the challenges facing their industry, the importance of innovation and integrity, and the company's commitment to both their employees and their clients. As he spoke, I noticed David straightening beside me, his entire body language shifting into what I recognized as his presentation mode. Then, Marcus's tone changed. He began discussing the importance of transparency and accountability in their business. He mentioned that recent internal audits had revealed some concerning discrepancies in project billing and client account management. The room grew noticeably tense, with several people exchanging glances and shifting uncomfortably. David's hand found my arm, his grip tight enough to be uncomfortable. Marcus continued, explaining that the company had hired an external investigative firm to conduct a thorough review of their financial practices and project management procedures. He emphasized that this was a proactive measure designed to protect both the company and their clients, and that they were committed to complete transparency throughout the process. As he spoke, His eyes seemed to scan the room, lingering on certain individuals, including, I noticed, David. The speech concluded with Marcus's assurance that the investigation would be conducted fairly and professionally, and that anyone with information relevant to the audit should feel free to contact him or the external investigators directly. He provided contact information and emphasized that the company had a strict non-retaliation policy for anyone who came forward with legitimate concerns. As applause filled the room, David's grip on my arm became painful. I looked at him and was shocked by his expression. Gone was the confident, charismatic man who'd been holding court just minutes earlier. His face had gone pale, and there was something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like panic. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of strained conversations and forced normalcy. David seemed to be functioning on autopilot, maintaining the appearance of casual socializing while clearly struggling with some internal turmoil. I found myself watching him more carefully than ever before, noting the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking, the forced quality of his laughter, and the way he seemed to be avoiding certain colleagues who approached our group. Jennifer Walsh appeared beside us during one of these tense moments, her timing seeming almost deliberate. She engaged me in conversation about my volunteer work, asking detailed questions about the animal shelter's operations and funding. Her questions were intelligent and seemed genuinely interested, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was studying me as much as she was making conversation. When David excused himself to visit the restroom, Jennifer's demeanor shifted subtly. She moved closer to me, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. She mentioned that she'd heard wonderful things about my marketing background and asked whether I'd ever considered returning to professional work. The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her expression suggested there was more to it than casual career advice. Before I could respond fully, David returned, his face flushed and his breathing slightly elevated. He immediately inserted himself into our conversation, placing his arm around my waist in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. Jennifer acknowledged his return with a polite smile, but I noticed the way her eyes lingered on his face, as if she was cataloging his emotional state. As the evening wound down, David's anxiety became increasingly difficult to conceal. He spoke in rapid bursts, his usual charm replaced by an almost manic energy that made several people step back from conversations. When Marcus Rodriguez approached us to say goodbye, David's response was so effusive and over the top that even I felt embarrassed on his behalf. The drive home was conducted in almost complete silence. David gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. When I attempted to ask about Marcus's speech and what it might mean for his department, David snapped that it was routine corporate nonsense and that I wouldn't understand the complexities involved. His tone was sharper than anything I'd heard from him before, carrying an edge of contempt that made me recoil. I spent the remainder of the drive staring out the passenger window, processing not just his words, but the entire evening's strange undercurrents and David's increasingly erratic behavior. We lived in a modest but well-appointed townhouse in one of the city's more desirable suburban neighborhoods. David had insisted on the location and the mortgage payment that stretched our budget, claiming that our address was important for his professional image. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that I was seeing our home with new eyes, wondering for the first time how exactly we'd managed to afford it on David's salary alone. She reminded me that 5 years of marriage should have established enough trust and intimacy to weather temporary professional stress. After ending the call, I sat in my car feeling more confused than before. Emily's advice was sound and practical, based on her own successful marriage and her professional experience dealing with people under stress. Yet something inside me resisted her explanations, insisting that what I'd witnessed went beyond normal workplace pressure. I returned home that evening to find David still sequestered in his office, though the sound of typing and occasional phone conversations suggested he'd been actively working throughout the day. When I knocked on his door to offer dinner, his zawe response was curt and dismissive. He claimed he'd order something later and asked not to be disturbed unless it was an emergency. This level of isolation was completely unprecedented in our marriage. Even during David's busiest periods, he'd always made time for meals together and basic communication about our schedules and plans. His current behavior felt less like temporary work stress and more like deliberate avoidance of any meaningful interaction with me. Sunday followed a similar pattern, with David emerging from his office only for brief periods and offering minimal explanation for his behavior. When I suggested we attend the neighborhood barbecue we'd previously planned to go to, he declined with an excuse about urgent deadlines that needed his attention. I went alone, spending the afternoon making awkward explanations about David's absence while trying to maintain the appearance of marital normalcy. The barbecue was hosted by Tom and Linda Martinez, a couple in their 40s who lived 3 houses down from us and had become casual friends over the past 2 years. Tom worked in real estate development while Linda managed a local boutique, and they were the kind of socially connected people who seemed to know everyone in our neighborhood and beyond. During casual conversation over grilled burgers and beer, Tom mentioned that he'd recently had lunch with someone who worked at Meridian Financial Solutions. The man, whose name Tom couldn't quite remember, had made some concerning comments about internal investigations and employee accountability measures being implemented at the company. Tom's recounting was vague and secondhand, but it aligned closely enough with Marcus Rodriguez's speech from Friday night to make my stomach clench with anxiety. When I pressed Tom for more details, he admitted that he hadn't paid much attention to the specifics since it wasn't relevant to his own business interests. However, he did recall the man mentioning that several employees were being scrutinized for questionable billing practices and potential conflicts of interest with clients. The investigation was apparently more serious and far-reaching than Marcus had indicated in his public remarks. I left the barbecue early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The drive home gave me time to process this new information and its potential implications for David's recent behavior. If the investigation at Meridian was more serious than initially presented, and if David had reason to be concerned about his own involvement, his anxiety and isolation suddenly made more sense. However, this realization brought little comfort. If David was involved in questionable business practices, our entire life together was built on a foundation I didn't understand. The townhouse, the lifestyle, the future plans we'd discussed, all of it could be based on income sources that weren't what they appeared to be. That evening, I attempted one more time to initiate honest conversation with David about what was happening at his work and why he seemed so stressed. I approached him in his office during what appeared to be a break in his frantic activity, bringing him a cup of coffee and sitting down in the chair across from his desk. My questions were gentle and supportive, framed in terms of wanting to help him through whatever difficulties he was facing. I emphasized that we were partners in marriage and that he didn't need to handle professional problems alone. I even shared some of the concern that other people had expressed about the investigation at Meridian, hoping this would open the door for him to confide in me. David's response was unlike anything I'd experienced in our 5 years together. His face darkened with an anger that seemed disproportionate to my gentle inquiries. He accused me of gossiping about his personal business and interfering in matters I couldn't possibly understand. His voice rose to a level that made me instinctively recoil, and his words carried a contempt that felt deeply personal and hurtful. He told me that my job was to be supportive, not to question his professional decisions or discuss his business with neighbors and friends. He suggested that my volunteer work and social activities were making me restless and giving me too much time to create problems where none existed. Most painfully, he implied that my questions demonstrated a lack of trust that was damaging to our marriage. I left his office feeling hurt, confused, and increasingly isolated. The man who'd just spoken to me with such coldness and contempt bore little resemblance to the husband I'd married, or the person I'd thought I knew. The possibility that work stress alone could create such a dramatic personality change seemed Unlikely, suggesting that deeper issues were at play. That night, lying alone in our bed while David continued working in his office, I made a decision that would prove to be the beginning of the end of my marriage as I knew it. I decided to pay more attention to the details of David's behavior and our life together, to look for answers to questions I'd never thought to ask before. I resolved to approach this investigation with the same methodical approach I'd used in my marketing career when analyzing consumer behavior and market trends. I would observe, document, and research until I understood what was really happening in my marriage and my husband's professional life. I had no idea that this decision would lead me down a path of discovery that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. The following week brought a series of small revelations that, taken together, began to paint a disturbing picture of deception and manipulation that had been hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly normal life. It started with something as simple as David's morning routine, which I began observing with new attention to detail. For years, David had left for work at approximately the same time each morning, claiming that early arrival at the office gave him a competitive advantage and allowed him to prepare for the day without distractions. I'd accepted this explanation without question, often still being asleep when he departed. This week, however, I made a point of being awake and aware of his departure time. What I discovered was that David's departure time varied significantly, from day to day, sometimes by as much as 2 hours. On Tuesday, he left at 6:30 in the morning, claiming an early client meeting. On Wednesday, he didn't leave until after 9, casually mentioning that his first appointment wasn't until late morning. Thursday brought another early departure, while Friday saw him working from home until nearly noon before heading to what he described as client meetings. This irregular schedule wouldn't have been particularly concerning, except for the fact that David had always claimed his job required consistent early hours and regular schedule adherence. The discrepancy between his stated requirements and actual behavior suggested either that his job was different from what he'd described, or that his daily activities weren't actually work-related. I also began paying closer attention to David's phone behavior, noting patterns that had previously escaped my notice. He received significantly more text messages and phone calls than seemed normal for his stated job responsibilities, often at unusual hours, including early mornings, late evenings, and weekends. More troubling was his reaction to these communications, which involved stepping away from me to answer calls and responding to texts with a secretiveness that suggested personal rather than professional conversations. On Thursday evening, while David was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text message that appeared on the locked screen. The sender was identified only as KM, and the message preview read, "Friday's meeting confirmed for 2 p.m. Usual place. Delete this." The message disappeared from the screen before I could read it again, and David's phone required a passcode that I didn't know. This incident crystallized my growing suspicions that David was involved in activities he wasn't sharing with me. The secretive nature of the communication, combined with the instruction to delete the message, suggested something beyond normal business correspondence. I found myself wondering who KM was and what kind of meetings required such secrecy. Friday brought an opportunity for more direct investigation when David announced that he would be working late and wouldn't be home until after 10 o'clock. He claimed that a client crisis required immediate attention and that he'd probably need to grab dinner at the office while dealing with the situation. This was presented as an unfortunate but necessary professional obligation, and he seemed genuinely apologetic about the disruption to our evening plans. Instead of accepting this explanation at face value, I decided to verify David's whereabouts and activities. Using a family tracking app that we'd installed on our phones for safety reasons during a hiking trip the previous year, I was able to monitor David's location throughout the evening. What I discovered contradicted everything he'd told me about his plans. Rather than staying at his office building downtown, David spent most of the evening at an upscale restaurant across town, followed by nearly 2 hours at what appeared to be a private residence in an expensive neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. His phone showed him returning home at exactly the time he'd predicted, suggesting that his evening had been carefully planned rather than responsive to an unexpected crisis. When David arrived home at 10:15, he appeared relaxed and satisfied rather than stressed or tired from dealing with a work emergency. His explanation of the evening's events was detailed and convincing, including specific references to client concerns and resolution strategies that demonstrated considerable preparation. Yet I now knew that at least part of his story was fabricated, raising questions about everything else he'd told me. The most disturbing realization was that David was clearly capable of sustained, detailed deception about his activities and whereabouts. This wasn't a simple white lie or omission, but a carefully constructed false narrative that required advanced planning and considerable acting ability. The ease with which he'd lied to my face suggested that this wasn't the first time he'd done so, and probably wouldn't be the last. Saturday morning brought another revelation when I decided to examine our joint bank accounts and credit card statements with the same attention to detail I was now applying to David's behavior. As the person who typically managed our household finances, I had access to all of our accounts and usually reviewed the statements monthly for budgeting purposes. However, I'd never before looked for patterns or discrepancies that might reveal hidden activities. What I found was a series of regular cash withdrawals and credit card charges that didn't align with David's stated activities or our shared expenses. Large cash withdrawals occurred weekly, always from the same ATM near David's office, in amounts that seemed excessive for normal daily expenses. Credit card charges appeared at restaurants and entertainment venues during times when David claimed to be in meetings or working late, often in locations that didn't match his supposed business activities. Most concerning were monthly charges to what appeared to be luxury service providers, including a high-end spa, an exclusive men's clothing store, and several restaurants known for expensive business entertainment. These charges were always during weekday business hours and never included expenses that would suggest my presence or family-related activities. The financial evidence painted a picture of a lifestyle that David was maintaining separately from our shared life together. The amounts involved weren't enormous, but they represented a consistent pattern of spending on personal luxury items and entertainment that he wasn't sharing with me. More troubling was the realization that these expenses had been occurring for at least the past 18 months, suggesting a long-term pattern of financial deception. I spent Saturday afternoon trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about my husband and our marriage. The man who claimed to be working long hours and dealing with professional stress was apparently maintaining a secret social life that involved expensive restaurants, personal services, and activities he'd never mentioned to me. The disconnect between his stated reality and the evidence I was uncovering was becoming impossible to ignore. That evening, David announced that he needed to attend another work-related function the following week. This time, a client appreciation event that would require him to stay overnight in a nearby city. He presented this as a professional obligation that he was reluctant to fulfill, emphasizing the inconvenience and his preference to spend the time at home with me instead. Given everything I'd learned over the past week, I no longer believed David's explanation at face value. Instead, I saw it as another opportunity to investigate his actual activities versus his stated plans. I agreed to his overnight trip with apparent support and understanding, while privately planning to use his absence to conduct a more thorough investigation of his office, personal belongings, and any evidence he might have left behind. The realization that I was actively planning to spy on my own husband was both disturbing and liberating. 3 weeks earlier, such behavior would have seemed paranoid and destructive to our marriage. Now, it felt like the only way to understand what was really happening in my life and whether the foundation of our relationship was built on truth or elaborate deception. As I prepared for what might be the most important investigation of my life, I couldn't have imagined that the evidence I was about to uncover would reveal a level of betrayal and criminality that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married and the life we'd built together. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came sooner than expected when David announced on Tuesday morning that his overnight business trip had been moved up to Thursday. He seemed genuinely frustrated by the change, explaining that the client had requested an earlier meeting due to scheduling conflicts on their end. His irritation appeared authentic, which made me wonder if this trip was actually legitimate or if he was simply a better actor than I'd given him credit for. I spent Wednesday preparing for what felt like the most important 24 hours of my marriage. While David was at work, I made copies of our financial documents, photographed credit card statements, and created a detailed timeline of his recent behavioral changes. I also researched private investigators in our area, though I hoped my own investigation would provide enough clarity to make professional help unnecessary. Thursday morning, David left for his supposed business trip with the same level of detail and preparation he'd always shown for legitimate work travel. He packed his usual overnight bag, confirmed his return time for Friday evening, and kissed me goodbye with what seemed like genuine affection. As I watched his car disappear down our street, I felt a mixture of determination and sadness that my marriage had reached this point. The first place I decided to search was David's home office, a space that had always been considered his private domain. In 5 years of marriage, I'd rarely spent time in that room beyond brief conversations or delivering coffee during his work sessions. Now, as I sat in his desk chair and looked around with investigative intent, I realized how little I actually knew about David's daily work life. His desk drawers revealed the usual collection of office supplies, business cards, and miscellaneous paperwork that would be expected in any professional's workspace. However, as I examined the documents more carefully, I began to notice inconsistencies that troubled me. There were multiple business cards for restaurants and entertainment venues, but they were all annotated with handwritten notes that didn't seem business-related. Phrases like, "Kay prefers the back booth," and "good for private conversations," suggested personal rather than professional relationships. I also found a leather portfolio hidden beneath a stack of legitimate work files that contained documents I'd never seen before. Inside were what appeared to be investment statements and account information for financial products that weren't part of our joint portfolio. The amounts were significant, far beyond what David's salary should have allowed for personal investments, and the account names included initials and abbreviations I didn't recognize. Most disturbing was a handwritten notebook that appeared to track meetings, payments, and what looked like commission structures. The entries were coded in a way that made them difficult to interpret, but patterns emerged as I studied them more carefully. Regular monthly entries corresponded with dates when David had claimed to be attending client meetings or working late. Dollar amounts were noted next to initials that appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook. One name appeared more frequently than others, and my heart stopped when I realized it was Jennifer Walsh, the executive assistant from Marcus Rodriguez's office. The entries next to her name were different from the others, including notations like "information confirmed" and "timeline accelerated." These weren't business meeting notes. They were records of some kind of ongoing collaboration or information exchange. As I photographed the notebook pages with my phone, trying to capture evidence without disturbing the original arrangement, I heard a car door slam in our driveway. Panic flooded through me as I realized David might have returned unexpectedly. I quickly replaced everything in its original position and rushed to the living room, my heart pounding as I tried to appear, casually occupied with a magazine. To my relief, it was only our neighbor retrieving mail from their driveway. The false alarm, however, reminded me how dangerous my current activity was and how carefully I needed to proceed. If David discovered that I'd been searching his private space, any remaining trust in our marriage would be destroyed, and I'd lose the advantage of investigating while he believed his secrets were safe. I decided to shift my focus to less obvious sources of information, starting with David's computer browsing history and email accounts. His laptop was password protected, but I knew David well enough to guess several possibilities. After 3 failed attempts that made me nervous about account lockouts, I tried his mother's maiden name combined with our wedding anniversary year. The screen unlocked, revealing a desktop that looked professionally organized and entirely normal. His email inbox contained the expected mix of work communications, newsletters, and personal correspondence. However, as I scrolled through recent messages, I noticed that many of the emails from his colleagues were brief and formal, lacking the casual tone that usually develops between people who work closely together. More concerning was the absence of detailed project communications or collaborative discussions that should have been present if David was as involved in major client work as he claimed. I also discovered a separate email account that David had never mentioned, accessed through a bookmark in his browser labeled simply as consulting. This account contained a very different type of correspondence, including messages that appeared to be coordinating meetings with people outside his official workplace and discussions about opportunities that weren't related to Meridian Financial Solutions. One email thread particularly caught my attention because it involved detailed planning for what appeared to be some kind of presentation or proposal to potential investors. The language was vague, but suggested that David was involved in promoting investment opportunities that weren't officially sanctioned by his employer. The tone of the messages indicated that this was an ongoing side business that required careful coordination and discretion. As I read through more of these communications, a disturbing picture began to emerge. David appeared to be using his position at Meridian Financial Solutions to identify potential investors for outside opportunities, essentially leveraging his professional credibility and client relationships for personal gain. The investors seemed to believe they were participating in legitimate investment programs, affiliated with or endorsed by Meridian, while the reality was that David was operating independently and possibly fraudulently. The email correspondence also revealed the identity of several individuals who were clearly David's partners in these activities. Names that had appeared as initials in his handwritten notebook were now attached to detailed planning discussions and coordination of what appeared to be elaborate deception schemes targeting wealthy individuals who trusted David's professional reputation. Most shocking was the discovery of emails discussing the internal investigation at Meridian that Marcus Rodriguez had announced at the company party. David and his associates had been aware of the coming investigation for several weeks before the official announcement, and they were actively planning to shift blame to other employees while covering their own tracks. Jennifer Walsh's name appeared frequently in these discussions, confirming my suspicion that she was more than just an innocent colleague. The emails revealed that Jennifer had been providing David and his partners with advance warning about the investigation's scope and timeline, allowing them to prepare alibis and destroy evidence before the formal inquiry began. In exchange, she was receiving a percentage of the profits from their fraudulent investment schemes, making her a full partner in the criminal enterprise rather than simply an informant. Reading these communications felt like discovering that I'd been married to a complete stranger. The David described in these emails was calculating, manipulative, and completely comfortable with deceiving not only his employers, but also innocent investors who trusted him with their financial security. The casual tone of his discussions about covering up evidence and shifting blame to innocent colleagues revealed a level of moral corruption that I'd never suspected. I spent the next several hours printing and photographing the most incriminating emails, creating a comprehensive record of David's fraudulent activities and the network of people involved in the scheme. The scope of the operation was far larger than I'd initially suspected, involving multiple fake investment programs and potentially millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized that my investigation had uncovered evidence of serious financial crimes that went far beyond marital deception. David wasn't just lying to me about his activities. He was actively defrauding investors and manipulating his position at Meridian to facilitate criminal enterprises. The implications for our marriage were devastating, but the implications for the victims of his schemes were far more serious. I also discovered communications that revealed David's long-term plans for the fraudulent operation. Rather than viewing it as a temporary side business, He and his partners were planning to expand their activities and eventually leave their legitimate employment to focus full-time on investment fraud. The timeline they'd established would have David resigning from Meridian within 6 months, ostensibly to start his own consulting firm, but actually to avoid the increasing scrutiny of the internal investigation. The emails also contained disturbing discussions about the need to maintain appearances with spouses and family members who might ask uncomfortable questions about sudden wealth or lifestyle changes. David had apparently been coaching his partners on how to explain their increased income to their families without revealing the true source. The casual way they discussed deceiving their loved ones was almost as troubling as their willingness to defraud investors. As I read through David's communications with his criminal partners, I began to understand the timeline of his recent behavioral changes. The stress and secrecy I'd observed weren't related to legitimate work pressure, but rather to the increasing complexity of maintaining multiple fraudulent schemes while avoiding detection by both his employer and law enforcement. The upcoming investigation at Meridian had accelerated his anxiety because it threatened to expose the entire operation. I also discovered that David's overnight business trips weren't related to client meetings at all, but rather to coordination, sessions with his criminal partners, and meetings with potential investors who lived in other cities. The detailed alibis he'd created for these trips were elaborate deceptions designed to maintain his cover while he expanded the fraudulent operation to new markets and victims. By evening, I had compiled overwhelming evidence that my husband was not only lying to me about his professional activities, but was actively engaged in serious financial crimes that could result in federal prosecution and lengthy prison sentences. The man I'd married was a criminal who had built our entire life together on money stolen from innocent investors who trusted his professional reputation. The emotional impact of these discoveries was overwhelming. I found myself alternating between anger at David's betrayal and shock at my own naivety in failing to recognize the signs of his criminal activities. The lifestyle we'd been living, the home we'd purchased, the future plans we'd discussed, all of it was built on a foundation of fraud and deception that could collapse at any moment. I also realized that my own legal and financial situation was potentially compromised by David's activities. Depending on how the authorities chose to pursue the case, I could face scrutiny about my knowledge of David's crimes and whether I'd benefited from the proceeds of his fraudulent schemes. The townhouse we lived in, the joint bank accounts we shared, even my own personal assets could be subject to forfeiture if they were determined to be connected to criminal proceeds. That evening, as I sat alone in our living room surrounded by printed emails and financial documents that revealed the scope of David's criminal enterprise, I faced the most difficult decision of my life. I could confront David directly when he returned from his fake business trip, giving him the opportunity to explain his actions and potentially manipulate me into silence or complicity. Alternatively, I could report his activities to the authorities, effectively ending our marriage, and potentially sending my husband to prison. There was also the question of the other victims of David's schemes, innocent investors who were being systematically defrauded by my husband and his criminal partners. Did I have a moral obligation to protect them by exposing the operation, even if it meant destroying my own life in the process? The emails I'd read contained enough information to potentially save these victims from losing their life savings, but only if I was willing to take action against my own husband. I spent most of the night reviewing the evidence I'd gathered and trying to process the magnitude of David's betrayal. The man I'd loved and trusted for 5 years had not only been lying to me about virtually every aspect of his professional life, but had been using our marriage as cover for serious criminal activities. Every conversation we'd had about his work, every explanation he'd given for his activities, every plan we'd made for our future together had been based on lies and criminal proceeds. The next morning brought a text message from David confirming his expected return time and expressing what seemed like genuine affection and anticipation about seeing me again. Reading his loving words while surrounded by evidence of his criminal activities created a surreal disconnect that made me question my own sanity. How could the man who wrote such tender messages be the same person who casually discussed defrauding innocent investors and destroying evidence of his crimes? I realized that I needed professional advice about my legal situation and the potential consequences of the various actions I could take. I couldn't discuss the situation with friends or family members without potentially compromising any future legal proceedings, but I could consult with an attorney who would be bound by confidentiality requirements to protect my interests. Using an internet search, I identified several criminal defense attorneys in our area who specialized in white-collar crime and financial fraud cases. I selected one whose website emphasized experience with cases involving spouses who discovered their partner's criminal activities, suggesting that my situation wasn't entirely unique. I made an appointment for later that day, using a consultation fee from my personal account to avoid creating any financial records that David might discover. The attorney, Rebecca Martinez, was a woman in her early 50s with the kind of calm professionalism that immediately put me at ease. Her office was located in a downtown building that specialized in legal services, providing an additional layer of anonymity for our meeting. As I explained my situation and presented the evidence I'd gathered, her expression remained carefully neutral, though I could see her taking detailed notes about the scope of David's apparent criminal activities. After reviewing the emails and financial documents I'd brought, Rebecca confirmed that the evidence suggested serious federal crimes including wire fraud, mail fraud, and potentially money laundering depending on how David and his partners had structured their operations. She explained that the penalties for such crimes could include lengthy prison sentences and substantial financial penalties, making this far more serious than simple marital infidelity or business ethics violations. Rebecca also explained my own legal vulnerability as David's spouse and potential beneficiary of criminal proceeds. While I clearly hadn't been involved in the fraudulent schemes, I could still face civil forfeiture actions against assets that were purchased with crime proceeds, and I might be required to cooperate with federal investigators as part of any criminal prosecution. The sooner I voluntarily came forward with information, the more likely I would be to receive favorable treatment from prosecutors. Most importantly, Rebecca emphasized that I had a narrow window of opportunity to protect myself legally while potentially helping the victims of David's schemes. If I waited until law enforcement discovered the fraud through their own investigation, I would lose the advantage of being seen as a cooperative witness rather than a potentially complicit spouse. The internal investigation at Meridian suggested that discovery of the fraud was imminent, meaning that my decision needed to be made quickly. Rebecca also explained the process of reporting financial crimes to federal authorities and what I could expect if I chose to come forward with the evidence I'd gathered. The investigation would likely be handled by the FBI in coordination with other federal agencies, and I would probably be required to provide detailed testimony about my discovery of David's activities and my knowledge of his business practices. As I left Rebecca's office with a clear understanding of my legal situation and options, I felt both terrified and relieved. The decision I needed to make was still difficult, but at least I now understood the consequences of each possible course of action. I had enough evidence to expose David's criminal enterprise and potentially save his victims from further losses, but doing so would irreversibly destroy our marriage and possibly result in David's imprisonment. That afternoon, I received a phone call that would eliminate any remaining doubt about the course of action I needed to take. The caller was Jennifer Walsh, the executive assistant whose collaboration with David I'd discovered in his emails. Her tone was friendly and professional, but the purpose of her call was clearly more complex than simple social conversation. Jennifer explained that she'd been thinking about our conversation at the company party and wondered if I might be interested in learning about some investment opportunities that had recently become available through David's business network. She emphasized that these were exclusive opportunities only available to a select group of people, and that David had mentioned I might be interested in diversifying our personal investment portfolio. As Jennifer described the investment program, I realized that she was attempting to recruit me as a victim of the same fraudulent scheme that David and his partners were operating. The opportunity she described matched exactly with the fake programs detailed in David's emails, complete with unrealistic return promises and vague explanations about the underlying investment strategy. The audacity of Jennifer's attempt to defraud me while maintaining the pretense of friendship was breathtaking. She was essentially trying to use my relationship with David to legitimize a criminal scheme designed to steal my money. The casual confidence with which she made this pitch suggested that she and David had probably recruited other spouses and family members as victims, expanding their criminal enterprise to include the very people who should have been able to trust them most. I managed to maintain a neutral tone during the conversation, expressing polite interest while avoiding any commitments. Jennifer seemed pleased with my response and suggested that we schedule a meeting to discuss the opportunity in more detail. She recommended that we meet privately without David present, claiming that he preferred to keep his business activities separate from family discussions. After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence as the full scope of David's criminal operation became clear. Not only was he defrauding investors through his professional connections, but he and his partners were also targeting the spouses and family members of their own criminal network. The level of calculation and moral corruption required to systematically deceive and steal from people who trusted them was beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Jennifer's phone call also provided me with an opportunity to gather additional evidence that could be crucial for any criminal prosecution. If I could record our planned meeting and document her fraudulent sales pitch, it would provide prosecutors with direct evidence of the criminal enterprise's operations and methods. Rebecca Martinez had explained that such evidence could be invaluable for proving the scope and intentionality of the fraud. I spent the remainder of the afternoon researching legal recording requirements and considering how to safely document Jennifer's fraudulent sales presentation without putting myself at risk. The stakes of my investigation had escalated beyond simple marital concerns to active participation in gathering evidence that could bring down an entire criminal network. As evening approached and David's return time drew near, I realized that I'd reached a point of no return in my investigation. The evidence I'd gathered was too serious to ignore, and Jennifer's attempt to recruit me as a victim had eliminated any remaining doubt about the criminal nature of David's activities. The man I'd married was not only a fraudster, but was actively working to expand his criminal enterprise to include his own wife as a victim. The decision about how to proceed was no longer just about my marriage or my personal situation. It was about preventing additional innocent people from being victimized by David's criminal network and ensuring that the people who'd already been defrauded had a chance to recover their losses. The moral weight of this responsibility was overwhelming, but the evidence I'd gathered left me no choice but to act. When David returned home that evening with flowers and stories about his successful business trip, I found myself studying his face and mannerisms with new understanding. The confident smile, the casual affection, the detailed explanations about client meetings and business developments, all of it was performance designed to maintain the illusion of legitimate professional success while concealing the reality of criminal enterprise. As we shared dinner, and David recounted his supposed business activities, I realized that every word he spoke was either a complete fabrication or a careful distortion of his actual criminal activities. The man sitting across from me wasn't just lying about his recent trip. He was systematically deceiving me about every aspect of his professional life while planning to make me his next victim. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, apparently satisfied with the success of his latest criminal coordination session, I made the final decision that would change both of our lives forever. I would report his activities to federal authorities, cooperate fully with their investigation, and do everything possible to help his victims recover their losses. The marriage I'd believed in for 5 years was over, destroyed not by my actions, but by David's choice to build our life together on a foundation of crime and deception. The man I'd loved had never really existed, replaced by a criminal who viewed his own wife as just another potential victim to be exploited for financial gain. The David Hayes I'd married was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. The FBI field office in downtown Philadelphia was nothing like what I'd expected from television shows and movies. Instead of dramatic interrogation rooms and bustling activity, I found myself in a sterile conference room that could have belonged to any corporate office building. Special Agent Catherine Brooks sat across from me with a patience that suggested she'd handled many cases like mine before, though her focused attention made it clear that she understood the significance of what I was bringing to her attention. Agent Brooks was a woman in her early 40s with graying blonde hair and the kind of steady demeanor that immediately inspired confidence. When I'd called the FBI tip line 3 days earlier, I'd expected to be transferred through multiple departments and possibly dismissed as a paranoid spouse. Instead, my call had been routed directly to Agent Brooks, who specialized in white-collar financial crimes and had apparently been tracking patterns of investment fraud that aligned closely with David's activities. As I spread the printed emails, financial documents, and photographs across the conference table, Agent Brooks examined each piece of evidence with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Her questions were precise and focused, designed to establish timelines, identify key players, and understand the scope of the criminal enterprise I'd uncovered. What surprised me most was Agent Brooks's revelation that David's name had already appeared in their preliminary investigation of suspicious investment activities targeting clients of mid-sized financial consulting firms. The FBI had been tracking a pattern of fraudulent investment schemes that shared common characteristics with the evidence I'd brought, but they'd lacked the internal documentation needed to understand how the schemes operated and who was involved. Agent Brooks explained that several victims had already come forward with complaints about investment opportunities they'd been offered through their financial advisors. But the schemes had been structured in ways that made it difficult to trace the money or identify the perpetrators. The emails I'd discovered provided the missing pieces that could connect the fraudulent investments to specific individuals and reveal the organizational structure of the criminal network. The scope of the investigation was far larger than I'd realized. David's criminal enterprise was apparently part of a broader pattern of investment fraud that had been operating across multiple states and had potentially victimized hundreds of people. The FBI estimated that the total losses could exceed $10 million, making this a major federal case that would likely result in significant prison sentences for anyone involved. Agent Brooks also confirmed my suspicions about Jennifer, Walsh's role in the criminal enterprise. The FBI had been monitoring communications at Meridian Financial Solutions as part of their investigation into the company's internal security breaches, and Jennifer's access to confidential information had made her a person of interest. The evidence I'd provided would allow them to establish her direct involvement in the fraudulent schemes and her role in providing inside information to David and his partners. The meeting with Agent Brooks lasted nearly 4 hours as we went through every piece of evidence in detail and discussed the timeline of my discoveries. She explained that my cooperation would be crucial for the success of the federal prosecution, but that I would also need to be prepared for the personal consequences of my decision to come forward. Most immediately, I would need to continue acting normally around David while the FBI prepared to execute search warrants and make arrests. This meant maintaining the pretense of our marriage while knowing that I was actively participating in an investigation that would likely send him to prison. Agent Brooks emphasized that my safety was a priority, but that the success of the investigation depended on David not suspecting that his criminal activities had been discovered. The FBI would also need to monitor my planned meeting with Jennifer Walsh to gather additional evidence of the fraudulent sales techniques being used to recruit new victims. Agent Brooks provided me with recording equipment and coached me on how to encourage Jennifer to provide specific details about the investment programs without appearing overly eager or suspicious. As I left the FBI field office that afternoon, I felt a mixture of relief and terror that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Relief that I'd finally taken action to stop David's criminal activities and protect his victims, but terror about what the next few weeks would bring as the investigation moved forward. I was no longer just discovering my husband's crimes. I was actively participating in bringing him to justice. The drive home gave me time to process the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. Within days or weeks, FBI agents would be searching our home, seizing our financial records, and arresting David for federal crimes that could result in decades in prison. Our marriage, our shared life, our future plans, everything would be destroyed by the revelation of David's criminal activities. Yet as difficult as these consequences would be, I knew that I'd made the right choice. The victims of David's schemes deserved justice, and the people he was planning to target in the future deserved protection. My personal suffering was insignificant compared to the financial devastation that David and his partners had inflicted on innocent investors who'd trusted them with their life savings. That evening, David returned home from work with his usual cheerful demeanor, completely unaware that his wife had spent the day providing federal agents with evidence of his criminal activities. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, and was full of stories about his day at the office that I now knew were complete fabrications designed to maintain his cover. As we shared dinner and David described his supposed client meetings and project developments, I found myself studying every word and gesture for signs of deception. The ease with which he constructed elaborate lies about his daily activities was both impressive and terrifying. He spoke with such conviction and detail that I might have believed his stories even with my current knowledge of his true activities. David also mentioned that he'd received a call from Jennifer Walsh about scheduling a meeting to discuss some investment opportunities with me. He presented this as a favor that Jennifer was offering to help us diversify our personal portfolio, and he seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the potential benefits. Watching him encourage me to participate in what I knew was a fraudulent scheme designed to steal my money was perhaps the most sickening moment of our entire relationship. I managed to express appropriate interest in Jennifer's proposal while internally preparing for the recorded meeting that would provide the FBI with crucial evidence. David's encouragement of my participation in the scheme revealed the complete absence of any genuine love or protection in our marriage. He was literally facilitating my victimization by his criminal partners, treating his own wife as just another potential source of illegal income. The next few days passed in a surreal state of suspended reality as I maintained the appearance of normal married life while secretly coordinating with federal agents. I met with Agent Brooks twice more to review the evidence and prepare for the recorded meeting with Jennifer. Each session reinforced the seriousness of David's crimes and the likelihood that he would face substantial prison time when the investigation concluded. Agent Brooks also provided me with updates on the broader investigation, revealing that David's criminal network was even larger and more sophisticated than my initial discoveries had suggested. The FBI had identified at least 12 other individuals involved in various aspects of the fraudulent schemes, including several who worked at other financial consulting firms and had been using their positions to identify and recruit victims. The investigation had also revealed that David's criminal activities extended back at least 3 years, far longer than I'd initially suspected. The timeline meant that virtually our entire marriage had been built on proceeds from criminal activities, and that David had been systematically lying to me about his professional life from almost the beginning of our relationship. Most disturbing was the discovery that David and his partners had been specifically targeting vulnerable populations, including elderly investors, recent immigrants who might not fully understand the American financial system, and middle-class families who were trying to build retirement savings. The cruel calculation involved in selecting victims who could least afford to lose their investments revealed a level of moral corruption that made me question whether I'd ever really known the man I'd married. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at an upscale coffee shop downtown, a location that Jennifer had selected for what she described as privacy and discretion. Agent Brooks had explained that this type of venue was commonly used by financial fraudsters because it provided an informal atmosphere that made victims more comfortable while still allowing for detailed discussions about investment opportunities. I arrived at the coffee shop early, wearing the recording equipment that Agent Brooks had provided, and feeling more nervous than I'd ever been in my life. The knowledge that I was about to participate in gathering evidence against my husband's criminal associates created an emotional weight that was almost overwhelming. Yet I also felt a sense of purpose, knowing that my actions could help protect other potential victims from being defrauded. Jennifer arrived exactly on time, looking polished and professional in a way that would have impressed any potential investor. She greeted me with apparent warmth and enthusiasm, expressing genuine pleasure at the opportunity to help David and me explore new investment possibilities. Her friendly demeanor made it easy to understand how she and David had been so successful at recruiting victims for their fraudulent schemes. As we settled into a quiet corner booth, Jennifer began her sales presentation with the practiced ease of someone who'd delivered the same pitch many times before. She spoke about exclusive investment opportunities that were only available to a select group of people, emphasizing the high returns and low risks that made these programs so attractive. Her tone was confident and professional, exactly what potential victims would expect from someone offering legitimate investment advice. Jennifer's presentation was masterfully constructed to appeal to common investor desires, while avoiding specific details that might allow victims to independently verify the claims being made. She spoke about diversified portfolios, market opportunities, and risk management strategies using language that sounded sophisticated and credible but was actually meaningless when examined closely. The fraudulent investment program that Jennifer described promised annual returns of 15 to 20%, with minimal risk, figures that should have been obviously unrealistic to anyone with genuine investment knowledge. However, she presented these claims with such confidence and supported them with professional-looking documents that I could easily understand how victims might be convinced to participate. Jennifer also emphasized the exclusivity of the opportunity, claiming that the investment program had limited capacity and that new participants were only accepted through personal referrals from existing investors. This artificial scarcity was clearly designed to pressure potential victims into making quick decisions without conducting proper due diligence. As the meeting progressed, Jennifer's sales techniques became increasingly sophisticated and manipulative. She asked detailed questions about our financial situation, retirement goals, and risk tolerance, information that would allow her to tailor her pitch to our specific vulnerabilities. She also shared stories about other investors who had supposedly achieved remarkable returns through the program, creating social proof that made the opportunity seem more credible. Most disturbing was Jennifer's casual mention of David's enthusiastic participation in the investment program and his strong recommendation that I should also participate. She presented David as both a satisfied investor and a trusted professional whose judgment should carry significant weight in my decision-making process. The idea that my own husband was actively encouraging me to be victimized by his criminal associates was almost impossible to process emotionally. Jennifer's presentation lasted nearly an hour, during which she provided detailed information about the supposed investment strategy, the projected returns, and the process for participating in the program. She also offered to provide references from other investors who could attest to the program's success, though I suspected that these references would either be fabricated or provided by other members of the criminal network. The meeting concluded with Jennifer pressing me to make a preliminary commitment to participate in the investment program, emphasizing that the opportunity might not be available for much longer due to limited capacity. She provided me with documents to review and suggested that we schedule a follow-up meeting within the next few days to finalize my participation. As I left the coffee shop with Jennifer's fraudulent investment materials, I felt both nauseated and relieved. Nauseated by the extent of the deception I'd just witnessed and the realization that Jennifer and David had probably used identical techniques to victimize dozens or possibly hundreds of other people. Relieved that I'd successfully gathered the evidence that Agent Brooks needed to demonstrate the criminal enterprise's methods and establish Jennifer's direct involvement in the fraud. The recording I'd made would provide prosecutors with clear evidence of Jennifer's fraudulent sales techniques and her attempts to recruit new victims for the investment scheme. Combined with the documentary evidence I'd previously provided, this would give federal agents everything they needed to pursue serious criminal charges against all members of David's network. That evening, David asked enthusiastic questions about my meeting with Jennifer, expressing apparent genuine interest in my impressions of the investment opportunity she'd presented. His encouragement of my participation in what he knew was a fraudulent scheme designed to steal my money was perhaps the final confirmation I needed that our marriage was irretrievably destroyed by his criminal activities. I managed to express cautious interest in Jennifer's proposal while avoiding any firm commitments, explaining that I wanted to review the materials carefully before making any decisions. David seemed pleased with my response and offered to help me evaluate the investment opportunity, positioning himself as a supportive husband rather than an accomplice in a scheme to defraud me. The cognitive dissonance of listening to David offer financial advice about a fraudulent investment program that he'd helped design was almost overwhelming. The man who claimed to love me was actively facilitating my victimization by his criminal associates, treating our marriage as nothing more than a convenient source of additional victims for his illegal activities. 2 days later, Agent Brooks contacted me with news that would accelerate the timeline of the federal investigation. The FBI had received additional complaints from victims of David's investment schemes, including several who had lost substantial amounts of money and were demanding immediate action. The accumulating evidence and victim testimony had reached a threshold that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Agent Brooks explained that federal agents would be executing search warrants and making arrests within the next week, meaning that my period of maintaining normal appearances with David was about to end. She warned me that the arrest and search process would be traumatic and highly public, but that my cooperation with the investigation would be acknowledged in any subsequent legal proceedings. The FBI had also discovered that David and his criminal associates were planning to accelerate their activities in response to the ongoing investigation at Meridian Financial Solutions. Intercepted communications suggested that they were rushing to recruit additional victims and move money out of accounts that might be subject to seizure, indicating that they were aware their criminal enterprise was under threat. This revelation meant that David's recent behavioral changes weren't just related to general anxiety about the Meridian investigation, but to specific knowledge that law enforcement was closing in on his criminal activities. His stress and secretiveness were the result of his awareness that his illegal enterprise was about to be exposed, not innocent concerns about routine corporate audits. Agent Brooks also informed me that Jennifer Walsh had been placed under surveillance following our recorded meeting, and that the FBI had documented her contacting additional potential victims in the days since our conversation. The evidence I'd helped gather was already being used to prevent other people from being defrauded, providing immediate protection for potential victims who might otherwise have lost their savings. The knowledge that my actions were already helping to protect innocent people from David's criminal network provided some comfort as I prepared for the traumatic events that were about to unfold. While the destruction of my marriage was devastating, the prevention of additional financial crimes made the personal cost worthwhile. Agent Brooks scheduled a final preparation meeting for the weekend, during which she would brief me on what to expect during the arrest and search process. She emphasized that my safety remained a priority, but that I should be prepared for David's potential reaction when he realized that his wife had been the source of the evidence that led to his arrest. The possibility that David might become violent or threatening when he discovered my role in the investigation was something I'd tried not to think about. But Agent Brooks's warning forced me to confront this reality. The man I'd married had already demonstrated his willingness to engage in serious criminal activities that harmed innocent people. It wasn't unreasonable to think that he might also be capable of threatening or harming his wife if he felt sufficiently cornered or betrayed. As the weekend approached and I prepared for what might be my final days of married life, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been living what I thought was a normal, happy marriage with a successful husband and a bright future ahead of us. Now I was preparing to watch federal agents arrest my husband for crimes that could send him to prison for decades. The transformation had been gradual at first, beginning with subtle inconsistencies in David's behavior that had made me pay closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. But once I'd started investigating seriously, the evidence of his criminal activities had accumulated rapidly, revealing a level of deception and moral corruption that had completely destroyed my understanding of who my husband really was. The man I'd fallen in love with and married had apparently never existed, except as a carefully constructed persona designed to provide cover for David's criminal activities. Every conversation we'd had about his work, every explanation he'd given for his income and lifestyle, every plan we'd made for our future together had been based on lies and criminal proceeds. Yet as painful as this realization was, I knew that I'd made the right choice in coming forward with the evidence I'd discovered. The victims of David's schemes deserved justice, and the potential victims he was planning to target deserved protection. My personal suffering was insignificant compared to the financial devastation that David and his criminal associates had inflicted on innocent people who'd trusted them with their life savings. The final weekend of my marriage passed in a state of suspended reality as I maintained the appearance of normal domestic life, while knowing that federal agents were preparing to execute search warrants and arrest the man sleeping beside me. David seemed relaxed and affectionate, apparently confident that his criminal activities remained secret and that his marriage provided effective cover for his illegal enterprise. On Sunday evening, as David and I shared what I knew would be our last dinner together as husband and wife, I found myself studying his face and trying to understand how I'd been so completely deceived for so many years. The man sitting across from me bore no resemblance to the criminal mastermind whose emails I'd read and whose fraudulent activities I'd documented. He seemed genuinely loving and devoted, exactly the kind of husband that any woman would be grateful to have. Yet I now knew that this loving husband persona was just another performance in David's elaborate deception, no more real than his stories about client meetings and business development activities. The David Hayes I'd married was a fiction created to provide cover for criminal activities that had victimized dozens of innocent people and generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. As we went to bed that Sunday night, David kissed me goodnight with apparent genuine affection and expressed contentment about our life together and his optimism about our future. I lay awake beside him, knowing that by the end of the week, would be in federal custody and our marriage would be over forever. The irony that David's final night of freedom was spent expressing love and satisfaction with a marriage that had been built entirely on lies and criminal proceeds was almost too much to bear. But as I listened to his peaceful breathing and prepared for the chaos that Monday would bring, I felt certain that I'd made the right choice in exposing his crimes and protecting his victims from further harm. Monday morning arrived with thunderous knocking that shattered the quiet of our suburban street. FBI agents filled our doorway at 6 a.m. sharp, search warrants in hand and tactical gear gleaming under the porch light. David's face went white as Agent Brooks announced his arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The shock in his eyes wasn't just from being caught, but from realizing that someone close to him had provided the evidence. As they handcuffed him in our living room, David's gaze found mine across the chaos of agents searching our home. The moment of recognition was devastating. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to betrayal, and finally to something that looked almost like respect. He didn't say a word, but his eyes told me everything. He knew exactly who had brought his criminal empire crashing down. The search lasted 6 hours. Agents seized computers, financial records, phones, and boxes of documents that would help prosecutors build their case. Our neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching as our life was dismantled piece by piece. The townhouse we'd called home was now a crime scene, its purchase traced to fraudulent proceeds that would soon be subject to federal forfeiture. Jennifer Walsh was arrested simultaneously at her office, along with 4 other members of David's network. The coordinated raids netted enough evidence to ensure that the entire criminal enterprise would face justice. By evening, local news stations were reporting on the massive investment fraud scheme that had operated in plain sight for years. The Trial lasted 3 months. I testified as the government's key witness, detailing how I'd discovered David's crimes and decided to come forward. Facing him across the courtroom was surreal. This man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years, now sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. He never looked at me during my testimony, staring straight ahead as I described finding his fraudulent emails and recording Jennifer's sales pitch. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors documented over $8 million in investor losses and presented recorded conversations, financial records, and victim testimony that painted a clear picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. David's defense attorney tried to portray him as a misguided employee who'd gotten in over his head, but the jury saw through the manipulation. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, David finally met my eyes. There was no anger there anymore, just exhaustion, and something that might have been gratitude. He'd received 15 years in federal prison, but dozens of victims would recover at least part of their stolen savings. Jennifer got 12 years. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. 6 months later, I sat in my sister Emily's kitchen, signing the final divorce papers. The legal dissolution of our marriage was anticlimactic after everything we'd been through. I'd lost the townhouse to forfeiture, but kept my personal assets since I could prove they weren't connected to David's crimes. More importantly, I'd kept my integrity and helped ensure that justice was served. The Victims' Compensation Fund recovered about 60% of the stolen money. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd lost her entire retirement savings, sent me a handwritten thank you note that I still keep in my wallet. "You gave me hope that honest people still exist," she wrote. "Your courage saved us all." I moved across the country and found work with a nonprofit that helps fraud victims navigate the legal system. Using my marketing background and hard-earned experience, I help people rebuild their lives after financial crimes. It's meaningful work that feels like redemption for the years I unknowingly benefited from criminal proceeds. Sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if I'd never investigated David's behavior, if I'd accepted his lies and remained willfully blind to his crimes? More people would have been victimized. More families would have lost their savings. More elderly couples would have seen their retirement dreams destroyed by sophisticated criminals who preyed on trust and hope. David writes to me occasionally. From prison, letters I don't answer, but can't bring myself to throw away. He expresses remorse and claims to be using his time to educate other inmates about the consequences of white-collar crime. I hope that's true, but I've learned not to trust his words without independent verification. The night he hit me at that business party feels like a lifetime ago, though it's only been 18 months. That slap was the catalyst that opened my eyes to who David really was beneath his charming facade. In a twisted way, I'm grateful for that moment of violence because it shattered my illusions and forced me to see the truth. I'm 34 now, starting over in a new city with a new career and a hard-earned understanding of my own strength. The woman who was too trusting, too willing to accept explanations without evidence, no longer exists. In her place is someone who asks difficult questions and demands honest answers. Someone who understands that love without truth is just another form of fraud. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.